Daniel's dreams began in silence. There was no warning, no preamble, just the abrupt sensation of plummeting through an infinite void. The air around him was icy and thin, whipping past his face as he fell. His arms flailed, but there was nothing to grab onto, only darkness stretching in every direction. He couldn't see the ground, but the dread of impact gnawed at him with every passing second. The dream always ended the same way. Just as the weight of inevitability pressed on his chest and the imagined ground seemed close enough to shatter him, Daniel would wake with a violent jolt. His heart hammered in his chest as if it were trying to escape, and his breathing came in shallow gasps. The faint hum of the early morning city filtered through his apartment, but it did little to ground him in reality. At first, Daniel dismissed the dreams as nothing more than a fluke, the result of late nights and endless cups of coffee. He laughed it off to his friends at lunch. Stress dreams, he had said, though his voice wavered slightly when he explained the sensation of falling. But that first dream left a mark, one he couldn't shake. The sensation of falling lingered long after he woke, like a phantom itched beneath his skin. Each night, when he lay in bed, he felt an inexplicable tension in the room. He told himself it was exhaustion or his mind playing tricks. But something about the silence felt expectant. It wasn't until he noticed the faint bruises on his forearms that his unease grew into something darker. The smudges were small, but distinct, as if someone had grabbed him in his sleep. He stared at them for a long time that morning, his stomach churning with unease. The day carried on as normal, but Daniel couldn't shake the feeling that something unseen had followed him from the void. The nights came, and so did the dreams. The dreams returned every night, each one more vivid than the last. The void was endless, and Daniel felt as though he had been falling for lifetimes. The sensation became so real that he could feel the icy wind burning his face, hear the roar of air rushing past his ears, and sense his stomach lurching with the weightlessness of free fall. He woke up in terror each time, drenched in sweat, clutching at his chest. The lingering sensation of falling haunted his waking hours, making him stumble on stairs or feel unsteady on his feet. Bruises continued to appear on his arms and legs, dark smudges that looked like handprints. "You're working too hard," his coworker Nina said as she handed him a coffee one morning. "You look like you haven't slept in weeks." Daniel forced a smile, but said nothing. How could he explain the fear clawing at him every night, or the marks that felt more like warnings than coincidences? He tried to rationalize it. Maybe he was tossing and turning in his sleep and hitting the headboard. Maybe he was clumsy and hadn't noticed bumping into things. But deep down, he didn't believe it. At night, the tension in his apartment grew palpable. Shadows seemed darker, sounds sharper. The air itself felt heavier. He avoided mirrors, unwilling to see the exhaustion etched on his face, or something worse. It wasn't just the dreams. The void was following him. It started with a whisper. One night, as Daniel fell into the now familiar void, a shadowy figure appeared in the distance. It had no face, no features, but its presence was undeniable. The void itself seemed to fold around it, and Daniel felt its unseen gaze like icy fingers against his spine. "Not yet," it whispered. The voice was neither loud nor soft. It simply existed, cutting through the rush of air like a blade. Daniel woke with a start, his heart racing. For the first time, he didn't feel alone in his own bedroom. The silence was suffocating, the kind that buzzed in his ears and made the small noises of the apartment, creaking pipes, the hum of the refrigerator, feel like intrusions. The figure became a recurring presence in his dreams. It didn't move closer, but it didn't have to. Its mere existence filled Daniel with dread. Waking life began to blur. Gravel found in his shoes after a restless night. Handprints on his bedsheets that weren't his own. He started leaving lights on, keeping the television running in the background, anything to banish the oppressive quiet that had settled into his home. But none of it stopped the shadow. Daniel sat at his desk, exhausted and shaking, staring at an old photograph. It was a picture of him as a child, grinning on a family trip by a river. He had pulled the photo from a dusty box in the attic after an image from his dream resurfaced. The feeling of falling, not just into the void, but into water. The memory hit him like a freight train. He was 8 years old, running across a bridge with his older brother. The wooden planks were slick from rain, and his foot had slipped. He remembered the rush of cold water closing over him, the panic as he tried to breathe, and the arms that had pulled him to safety. A man had saved him that day, a stranger whose name Daniel couldn't remember. But as the memory sharpened, he realized something else. The man hadn't come out of the water with him. Digging through online archives, Daniel found what he feared. A local news article from 20 years ago described his accident. Man drowned saving child. The headline read, his savior's body had never been recovered. The shadow in his dreams wasn't a figment of his imagination. It was someone he had left behind. When Daniel looked up from his laptop, the air around him felt different, heavier. A whisper brushed past his ear, so faint he almost missed it. You walk free, but you're not free. The next dream was unlike any before. Daniel wasn't falling this time. He stood on solid ground, though the void stretched infinitely around him. It was cold and silent, the kind of silence that swallowed sound and made him feel small. Ahead of him, the shadow waited. This time, it wasn't a distant figure. It loomed large, its form shifting and rippling like black smoke. You should have died, it said. The voice reverberated through the void, more felt than heard. I saved you, and I paid the price. Now, you will take my place. I didn't ask you to save me, Daniel shouted, his voice trembling. The words sounded hollow even as he spoke them. The shadow surged forward, closing the distance in an instant. Daniel froze as it towered over him, its formless face mere inches from his own. You owe me, it hissed. The ground beneath him trembled, cracks spreading like spiderwebs. Below the cracks, there was nothing, just more void, yawning and endless. Desperation clawed at Daniel's chest. I was a child, he whispered. I didn't know. And yet you live, the shadow replied. You have walked this world while I have fallen, again and again. But now it ends. The cracks widened, and the ground gave way beneath Daniel's feet. He screamed as he fell into the void, the shadow's laughter echoing around him. Daniel woke up on the floor of his apartment, his breath shallow and his body trembling. For the first time in weeks, his bedroom was silent. No whispers, no heaviness in the air. He sat up slowly, half expecting the shadow to lunge at him from the corner of the room. But nothing happened. The morning sun streamed through the window, warm and reassuring. He dared to hope that it was over. But as he got to his feet, something crunched beneath him. He looked down and saw gravel scattered across the floor. His stomach dropped. Turning toward the mirror on the wall, he froze. His reflection stared back, but something was wrong. It moved too slowly, lagging a fraction of a second behind his movements. And then it smiled. Daniel stumbled back, his heart pounding as a whisper curled through the room, soft and mocking. Not yet. The days passed, but the whispers didn't stop. Daniel lived in constant fear. The boundary between dream and reality now completely dissolved. The gravel appeared in odd places, his shoes, his pockets, even his bed. Late one night, he stood by the window, staring out at the city lights. The wind howled softly, but to Daniel, it was more than just wind. It was the sound of the void, waiting to claim him. And as he turned away, he heard it one last time. Not yet. Jacob's dreams had always been forgettable, a passing blur of nonsensical images and fleeting sensations that slipped from his mind as soon as he woke. But this dream was different. It began with icy water. He stood on the edge of a dark lake, the wind slicing through the stillness around him. The woman appeared suddenly, her pale arms thrashing as she struggled to stay above the water. Her face was desperate, her cries muffled by the lapping waves. Jacob froze, every instinct telling him to dive in, but his body wouldn't move. He could only watch. The scene sharpened unnaturally. He could see the soaked strands of her blonde hair plastered to her face, the water pulling her deeper, and the terror in her wide green eyes as they locked onto his. The lake seemed endless, the black depths swallowing her completely. When she disappeared beneath the surface, silence returned, deafening and absolute. Jacob woke with a start, his body drenched in sweat. The dream clung to him in a way no other had. He felt the chill of the lake on his skin, the weight of the moment pressing on his chest. He shook his head, forcing himself to dismiss it. Stress, he thought. Just stress from the job. 2 days later, as he sipped coffee and scrolled through the news on his phone, a headline froze him in place. Local woman found dead in lake. The photo beneath it showed her face, blonde hair, green eyes. The same face he'd seen in his dream. Jacob's stomach churned. The details of her death matched the dream exactly. A chill crept through him, colder than the lake itself. He tried to push the thought away, but a nagging question lingered. How could he have dreamed of her death before it happened? The dream had felt real, too real. The image of the drowned woman haunted Jacob. He tried to convince himself it was just coincidence, but the gnawing doubt refused to leave him. The next dream came a few nights later. He was on a rain-soaked highway, standing by the side of the road. Headlights sliced through the darkness, but they couldn't illuminate the thick fog rolling in. A car came speeding toward him, its tires screeching as it lost control. The crash happened in slow motion. The car spun wildly, flipped, and landed on its roof with a deafening crunch. Jacob could see everything: the shattered glass, the crumpled hood, and the lifeless body of the driver slumped against the steering wheel. Blood seeped across the cracked leather seat. When Jacob woke, his heart was pounding. The scene played on a loop in his mind, vivid in every detail. He could even recall the man's face, frozen in a final moment of terror. 3 days later, the news confirmed his fears. A car crash on a local highway. A man mid-30s killed instantly. Every detail matched the dream. The rain, the fog, even the make of the car. Jacob stared at the news report, his hands trembling. This wasn't stress or imagination. His dreams were becoming a window into death, and there was nothing he could do to stop them. Each time he closed his eyes, the void seemed to call him back, dragging him into another nightmare. The next dream wasn't about a stranger. Jacob found himself standing in the middle of a burning building. Flames licked the walls, and smoke choked the air. He turned, coughing, and saw her, Liz. She was his friend, his partner on the ambulance. She was pinned beneath a collapsed beam, her uniform stained with blood. "Jacob!" she screamed, reaching for him. He lunged forward, but his hands passed through her as if she wasn't real. The fire roared louder, and the scene melted into blinding light. He woke up shouting, his chest heaving. For the first time, Jacob truly felt helpless. He couldn't save Liz in the dream, and he feared he wouldn't be able to save her in reality either. At work the next day, he avoided her. Liz noticed. "Hey, are you okay?" she asked, concern in her voice. Jacob forced a smile, nodding stiffly. But every time he looked at her, all he could see was the fire. The dreams came more frequently, and the victims became people he knew. Neighbors, friends, co-workers. He began withdrawing from everyone, terrified that his presence might somehow doom them. His sleepless nights caught up with him at work, where he made mistakes, small ones at first, but enough to earn questioning looks. Jacob's world was unraveling. Sleep had become his enemy, but exhaustion was closing in. Desperation led Jacob to the internet, scouring forums and obscure blogs for answers. He stumbled upon a collection of stories about precognitive dreams. Most were vague accounts of people seeing symbols or vague warnings in their sleep, but one thread caught his eye: the curse of the Dreamweavers. According to the legend, Dreamweavers were cursed individuals chosen by death itself. They served as vessels, forced to witness impending deaths, but powerless to intervene. Worse, their dreams weren't merely warnings. They were the mechanism by which death claimed its victims. Jacob's chest tightened as he read. The accounts described the same vivid clarity he experienced in his dreams. The helplessness, the guilt. One line sent a chill through him. A Dreamweaver's curse cannot be broken. They see death because they owe death. Oh, death. Jacob thought back to his career as a paramedic. How many lives had he saved? How many people had he brought back from the brink? The dreams weren't random. They were penance. That night, Jacob didn't fight sleep. He was too exhausted, too defeated. When the dream came, it wasn't a stranger or a friend this time. It was him. He stood in his own apartment, the air heavy with despair. Pill bottles were scattered across the coffee table, their contents spilling out like tiny beads of poison. His own body lay slumped on the floor, eyes half open, staring into nothingness. Jacob screamed at the sight, but his dream self remained still. The scene was painfully vivid. The dim yellow light of the table lamp, the empty beer cans on the floor, the faint sound of the clock ticking on the wall. The hopelessness in his dead eyes was the worst part. Jacob woke with a strangled gasp, clutching his chest. The image wouldn't leave him. It wasn't just a nightmare. It was a premonition. He spent the next day in a haze, avoiding work and shutting himself off from the world. He wondered if all the deaths he dreamed of, the drowned woman, the car crash victim, Liz, were his fault. Was this his punishment for saving too many lives? The dream had felt like a message. His time was running out. Jacob resolved not to sleep. He stayed awake for days, drinking coffee and pacing his apartment. But the exhaustion took its toll. Shadows moved in the corners of his vision, dark shapes that disappeared when he turned his head. He heard faint whispers, his name spoken in voices he didn't recognize. His research offered one last hope. Some Dreamweaver legend spoke of a way to break the cycle, by making a choice within the dream. If Jacob could choose who lived and who died, he might be able to stop the dreams from consuming him. But the cost was high. One life would always have to be sacrificed to save another. As the whispers grew louder and his vision blurred, Jacob knew he couldn't fight it any longer. The void was calling him back. Jacob fell asleep, and the void engulfed him. This time, he stood in the middle of a disaster, a train derailment, bodies strewn across the wreckage. Screams echoed around him. A voice spoke from the darkness, "Choose." Jacob's breath hitched. Before him stood two figures, both alive but barely. A young girl and an elderly man. He knew what the voice wanted. Only one could be saved. Tears streamed down his face as he pointed to the girl. The void shifted, and the scene disappeared. When Jacob woke, the whispers were gone, but the weight of his choice remained. The dreams began without warning. Adrian found himself standing in a hallway that stretched endlessly in both directions. The air was heavy, carrying a faint metallic tang. Dim light bulbs flickered overhead, their dull yellow glow revealing rows of identical wooden doors. Each door was unmarked, with polished brass handles that gleamed faintly in the muted light. The sound of his footsteps echoed unnervingly, as though the hallway were alive, listening to his every move. At first, Adrian thought it was just another stress-induced nightmare. As a graphic designer, he often worked long hours, his deadlines tightening like a noose. The exhaustion, he reasoned, had seeped into his subconscious. But the hallway felt different, real, too vivid to be a simple fabrication of his overtired brain. Each night, he wandered the corridor, unable to resist its pull. He never opened the doors. Some part of him knew better, though he couldn't explain why. But at the end of the hallway stood a single, darker door. Unlike the others, it loomed ominously, its frame thicker and its brass handle dulled by time. It filled him with dread, yet each night, the compulsion to approach it grew stronger. Adrian always woke before he could touch the dark door. He'd find himself in his bed, heart pounding, sweat soaking his sheets. At first, he dismissed the dreams as harmless, a peculiar quirk of his overstimulated mind. But their frequency increased, and their intensity deepened. One morning, Adrian stared at his reflection in the bathroom mirror, dark circles framing his tired brown eyes. He splashed water on his face, willing the unease to leave him. Yet, even in the reflection, he thought he caught a glimpse of the hallway behind him, a fleeting image that vanished when he blinked. That night, the dream returned. The hallway stretched endlessly before Adrian, as it always did. But tonight, something was different. He found himself standing directly in front of a door, his hand already reaching for the brass handle. He hadn't intended to move. It was as though his body had acted on its own. The cool metal sent a shiver through his hand. The door swung open. Adrian stepped inside, and the hallway dissolved behind him. He was in his office. At first glance, everything seemed normal. Rows of desks, the faint hum of computers, the glow of fluorescent lights overhead. But the longer he stood there, the more he noticed the distortions. The air was too thick, the shadows too dark. Papers fluttered through the room as if caught in an invisible breeze. Yet the air was still. Then, Adrian saw it, a reflection of himself in a glass window. It wasn't him. The figure mimicked his posture but stared back with hollow eyes. Its face twisted into a cruel smile before vanishing altogether. Adrian stumbled backward, his heart pounding. The walls seemed to close in, the hum of the lights growing deafening. He slammed the door shut and found himself back in the hallway, gasping for breath. When he woke, the metallic smell of the handle lingered on his hand. For the first time, Adrian couldn't dismiss the dream as a trick of his mind. The hallway was invading his life, and he couldn't escape its pull. The hallway became more vivid with each passing night. Adrian found himself drawn to the doors, unable to resist their pull. The first door he opened after the office led to his childhood home. He stepped into the familiar living room, but something was wrong. The walls were cracked, dark stains spreading like veins across the peeling wallpaper. The air smelled of mildew and something metallic, almost like blood. "Hello," he called out, but his voice echoed back unnaturally, distorted and distant. The next door opened to his high school. The classrooms were empty, yet faint whispers filled the air. Desks sat in neat rows, but their surfaces were scratched with words he didn't recognize. Adrian turned to leave, but a locker slammed shut behind him, though no one was there. Each door revealed something darker, something more personal. One night, he opened a door and found his parents sitting at the dining table. They turned to face him, their mouths wide open in silent screams. Adrian shut the door in panic, unable to look at them any longer. In his waking life, the dreams consumed him. He grew withdrawn, avoiding phone calls and messages. Sophie, his closest friend, asked if he was okay, but he couldn't bring himself to explain. What could he say? That he was dreaming of places he knew, distorted by horrors he didn't understand? He didn't tell her about the hallway, or that one of the doors had shown her lifeless body. The dark door at the end of the hallway became the only one left. The others disappeared, leaving the hallway barren except for the single, heavy door. Adrian stood before it night after night, his hand trembling as it reached for the handle. He couldn't bring himself to open it. The dread was suffocating, a weight pressing on his chest. The door began to haunt him during the day. He saw its reflection in places it shouldn't be. The glass of a bus shelter, the dark surface of his coffee. Once, as he crossed the street, he glanced at a puddle and saw the door's outline instead of his own reflection. Sophie grew worried. She called him often, but he avoided her, too afraid to see her face. The image of her lifeless body, lying behind one of the doors, was burned into his mind. He stopped answering her calls altogether. That night, the pull toward the dark door was stronger than ever. Adrian stood before it, unable to breathe, the faint hum of the hallway growing louder. Adrian's fingers closed around the brass handle. The metal felt colder than ice, sending a sharp chill up his arm. He hesitated, every instinct screaming at him to turn back. But the door began to open on its own, the darkness spilling out like smoke. He stepped inside and found himself in a hospital room. The fluorescent lights flickered overhead, casting jagged shadows on the walls. Machines beeped steadily, their rhythmic hum blending with the whispers that filled the air. The whispers were faint at first, growing louder as Adrian took a hesitant step forward. On the bed lay a man, pale, motionless, hooked up to tubes and monitors. Adrian's heart stopped when he recognized the face. It was him. The comatose version of himself lay still, his chest rising and falling with mechanical precision. Shadows flickered across the room, pooling in the corners before stretching toward him. The whispers sharpened, forming words. You left him here. You escaped. You don't belong out there. Adrian stumbled backward, his legs trembling. Memories he had buried began to surface. The car accident, the cyclist swerving into his lane, the crash that followed. He had walked away with minor injuries, but someone else hadn't been so lucky. The man in the coma wasn't a stranger. He was the driver of the other car. Adrian had never visited him, never checked if he had survived. Until now. The shadows closed in around Adrian, their whispers rising to a deafening crescendo. Take his place, they demanded. You don't deserve to walk free. The scene shifted, the hospital room blurring into the endless hallway. The dark door loomed behind him, and the whispers pressed against his mind. Adrian's knees buckled as the weight of their accusations bore down on him. The shadows offered him a choice. Step through the door and take the comatose man's place, or leave and continue living while the man remained trapped in his broken body. Adrian's breath came in shallow gasps. The guilt was unbearable, the weight of his escape crushing. Tears streamed down his face as he whispered, I didn't mean to. The shadows surged, their forms twisting into something monstrous. Adrian felt the door pulling him closer, its cold brass handle brushing against his skin. He closed his eyes and screamed. Adrian woke up gasping, his chest heaving as though he'd been drowning. The dark door no longer appeared in his dreams, but its weight lingered. He couldn't forget the hospital room, the whispers, or the choice he didn't remember making. His waking life felt heavier, the guilt gnawing at him. He tried to make amends, reaching out to Sophie, repairing strained relationships, but the shadows of the hallway never truly left. One night, as he drifted off to sleep, he saw it again, a single door standing in the corner of his bedroom, its brass handle gleaming faintly in the moonlight.